He was just a quiet teenage boy in a hoodie sitting near the front of the plane with his laptop open. No one paid attention until the lead flight attendant stopped, looked him up and down and snapped, "Turn that off, you don't belong in this section." The cabin went silent. The boy didn't argue, he simply closed the screen calm as ever. But what no one knew was that in the next 6 minutes, he would silently connect to the plane system, uncover a hidden fault, and force the jet to ground unexpectedly. And when the truth came out about who he really was, even the pilot went speechless. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. The cabin was quiet except for the low hum of the engines. Seated near the front, a teenage boy named Ethan stared out the window. He wore a gray hoodie, the sleeves pulled over his hands. A small laptop rested on the tray in front of him, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. He didn't make noise. He didn't ask for anything. He simply typed, focused and still. Most passengers were settling in, flipping through magazines or chatting softly, but the lead flight attendant, Brenda, walked with purpose. She had been working for the airline for over 20 years and liked things her way, quiet, tidy, and in control. When she reached Ethan's row, her eyes narrowed. She didn't say hello. She just stopped, folded her arms, and stared at his screen. "You need to turn that off," she snapped. "We're not allowing personal devices during taxiing." Her voice was louder than necessary. A few people nearby glanced over. Ethan looked up surprised and nodded. "Okay," he said, closing the laptop. Brenda didn't move. She looked him over, his worn backpack under the seat, the hoodie, the quiet way he Satan. Then her expression tightened. "Are you in the right seat?" she asked. Her tone had changed. Suspicious now. He reached into his pocket and handed her his boarding pass. She barely glanced at it. "Premium section," she said out loud like it didn't make sense. "This isn't a school trip, kid. You sure you're not lost?" Ethan didn't say anything. He just looked at her, calm but firm. Brenda handed the pass back, shaking her head. "Fine," she muttered and turned away. But as she walked off, she said it just loud enough. "Useless little smartass." The words hung in the air. A man across the aisle named Greg heard it clearly. He leaned back in his seat, eyebrows raised. A woman in front, Karen, glanced over her shoulder. No one said anything. Not yet. Ethan sat very still. He looked down at his laptop again. His face didn't show much, but something had changed in his eyes. His fingers moved slowly, almost without thinking. He lifted the laptop screen, opened a different tab, and began to type again. Not angry, just focused. In the background, Brenda laughed lightly with another passenger, an older man named Richard, who was drinking his second glass of wine. She was cheerful now, pouring drinks, smiling. Wide, she didn't even glance at Ethan again. But something was already in motion. Ethan's screen flashed. A new window opened. Lines of data scrolled quickly. It didn't look like a game. It wasn't a movie. He was writing code, and within 6 minutes, something would happen that no one on that plane expected. Not even her. Ethan's fingers moved fast across the keyboard, each line of code more complex than the last. The passengers around him paid no attention. To them, he was just a quiet teenager, passing time with a laptop. Brenda was now at the back of the cabin, arranging snack trays with a younger flight attendant named Jenna. Jenna was soft-spoken and new to the job. She had noticed Brenda's cold tone earlier, but didn't say anything. Brenda was respected, or feared, depending on who you asked. As Brenda handed out drinks, she made sure to skip Ethan's row entirely. When Jenna politely asked, "Should I offer him something?" Brenda shook her head. "That's fine. Probably brought his own junk." "Focus on the real customers," she said under her breath. Jenna gave a tight nod but glanced toward Ethan, her face showing a flicker of unease. Meanwhile, Ethan didn't lift his head. The screen in front of him showed internal access points. Had quietly connected to the in-flight system through the plane's public Wi-Fi system that wasn't nearly as secure as people believed. His expression remained calm, but his work was focused, exact, and far beyond what most adults could understand. In the cockpit, the captain, a tall man named Brian, noticed a strange alert on one of the monitors. It blinked once, then disappeared. He frowned, thinking it might be a glitch. Nothing seemed out of place, so he made a mental note to check again later. Back in the cabin, Brenda continued her rounds as she passed Ethan once more. She narrowed her eyes at his laptop, still open, despite her earlier warning. "Didn't I tell you to keep that shut?" she barked. Before Ethan could answer, she leaned in and slammed the screen down. The click was sharp. A few passengers turned their heads again. Greg across the aisle stared at her, annoyed. "Was that really necessary?" he asked. Brenda looked at him. "Do you know what kind of equipment he's running? This isn't a toy. I don't want him interfering with flight systems or causing panic." Greg raised his eyebrows, as a kid sitting quietly. "Maybe try some respect." Brenda scoffed. "If he wants respect, he can act like he deserves it." Ethan sat still. His jaw tightened just slightly, but he said nothing. His laptop remained shut for now, but his mind was already running through the next steps. Brenda thought she had shut him down, but she had only added fuel to the fire. Ethan quietly reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a small wireless drive encrypted and invisible to the system. He connected it to the laptop's port without lifting the screen. Yet his next move wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about proof she had called him useless, but she was seconds away from learning just how wrong she was. The cabin remained still, but something in the air had changed. Ethan sat silently in his seat, his face calm, but behind his eyes thoughts were turning faster than the engines outside. The wireless drive was already connected. He waited until Brenda disappeared down the aisle before slowly lifting his screen. Careful not to make a sound, the screen lit up instantly, unlocking into a black command window full of moving code. His fingers began to work again, steady and practiced as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. Across from him, Greg glanced sideways and caught a glimpse of the screen. His brows furrowed slightly, not because he understood the code, but because of how serious the boy looked. He leaned back into his seat but kept an eye on him, his earlier defense still on his mind. Karen, the woman in the row ahead, turned in her seat again. She whispered to her husband, "That boy, I don't think he's just playing games. At the back of the plane." Brenda continued laughing with a group of regular travelers. She handed out snacks to Richard and his wife, and even stopped to ask about their trip. She was all smiles now, her sharp tone reserved for those she didn't think mattered. When Jenna brought up Ethan again, her voice unsure, Brenda waved her off with a smirk. "I told you he's just one of those kids who thinks they're smarter than everyone. I've seen it before. They cause problems, they act special, then they disappear. You'll learn to spot them." Jenna didn't reply, but she didn't smile either. Back at his seat, Ethan's code had started to make contact with the plane's internal communication system. Not to cause chaos, he wasn't that kind of person, but to test the very limits of what they thought was secure. His access was clean, quiet, and perfectly legal, if anyone cared to check. What no one knew was that Ethan wasn't just some tech-obsessed kid trying to show off. He was part of a trial program for young developers in transportation security handpicked after winning a national competition for aviation software encryption. But none of that mattered to Brenda. To her, he was just a quiet boy in a hoodie who didn't look like he belonged in the better seats, and so far no one had questioned her. That was about to change. In the cockpit, Captain Brian's screen blinked again. This time the system flashed a warning about an internal activity log being accessed remotely. He stiffened. "That's odd," he muttered, his co-pilot. Rachel looked over another glitch. "I'm not sure," he said. "I'll flag it for now." Inside the cabin, Ethan's fingers paused as the system pinged his connection. He adjusted his route and masked the source instantly. The breach wasn't meant to harm. It was just enough to leave a footprint mark, just enough to make someone upstairs notice what he was capable of. Just as Ethan reached for his water bottle, Brenda reappeared in the aisle. Her eyes locked on the screen again. "Didn't I tell you?" She started, but she didn't finish. She stepped closer and raised her voice. "You think you're special just because you can type fast. That makes you important now. You're just a kid who got lucky with a seat." Ethan looked up at her. Not angry, just tired. Before he could speak, Greg stood up. "That's enough," he said firmly, his voice echoing over the rows. Every head turned. Brenda froze, her smile gone. "Has not bothering anyone. Has not talking. Has not loud. And if I'm being honest," Greg added, "you've been treating him like dirt since the moment he boarded." Brenda's eyes widened. "Excuse me." "No," Greg cut in. Excuse you, some of us have been watching the way you skipped him during drinks, the way you slammed his laptop shut. If he's done something wrong, say it, but if not, maybe stop acting like he's already guilty of something. Karen turned around now too. He hasn't moved from his seat once. Honestly, I was more bothered by how she treated him than anything he's done. Brenda looked around. For the first time, she realized she might not have the cabin on her side, but it was already too late. Ethan turned back to his screen. His fingers moved again, just one final step. The connection was complete. The message was sent. Now all that remained was the response, and it was coming faster than Brenda could imagine. Brenda stood frozen, her lips parted, but no words coming out. The authority she normally wore so proudly was slipping, and the shift in the cabin was sharp. She glanced around expecting support, but instead found quiet eyes watching her, no with respect, but with judgment. Jenna stood a few rows back holding a tray of unopened snacks. She looked uncomfortable but didn't step in. Greg slowly sat back down, still staring at Brenda. Karen remained turned in her seat, one arm resting on the backrest, her expression firm. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was louder than any argument. Then Brenda straightened her back, smoothed her uniform, and muttered, "This isn't over." She turned sharply and walked toward the galley. Her shoes clicked against the floor, each step tighter than the last. Ethan didn't follow her with his eyes. He kept his focus on the screen. The final string of code had already been sent. All he had to do now was wait. What he triggered wasn't something dangerous. It was a controlled alert sent to a private security channel used by aviation testers. It included a full log of the in-flight systems, security gaps all identified within the last 5 minutes. The alert didn't go to the airline's tech department. It went directly to the federal team managing the trial he'd been assigned to. Meanwhile, Captain Brian's screen in the cockpit gave off another soft beep followed by a short tone. He leaned forward. The alert wasn't internal anymore. It came from an external control center, the same one that handled advanced flight safety and risk monitoring. Rachel looked over. "What's going on?" Brian pressed his earpiece in tighter. "They're telling us there's been a security test activated from inside our aircraft." Rachel's eyes widened. "A test from a passenger." "Looks like it," he said, voice low. "They sent confirmation just now. It came from a registered device listed under a temporary federal authorization, young cybersecurity trainee, assigned through a special clearance program." Rachel blinked. "Wait, someone's testing our system right now from inside this plane." "Not just testing it," Brian replied. "He already ran diagnostics, located vulnerabilities in our comm relay, and submitted a fix all within 8 minutes. And we didn't even notice." Rachel stared. "Who is it?" Brian tapped the ID on the message and read the name aloud. Back in the cabin, Ethan was closing his laptop gently. The screen dimmed and went dark. He leaned back in his seat, finally taking a breath. Around him, the energy had shifted. Karen gave him a small nod. Greg glanced over and smiled slightly. The kind of smile that said, "I knew it." A quiet approval, a shared understanding. At the back of the plane, Brenda paced inside the narrow galley, fuming. Her fingers were clenched tight around a half-empty cup of coffee. She had always trusted her instincts. She believed she could read people in seconds. To her, Ethan had looked like just another teenager, with a bad attitude and too much confidence. She had no idea who he really was, what he had just done. Then the phone in the galley rang. Startled, Brenda set her cup down and picked it up. "Yes," she answered sharply. Jenna, standing nearby, looked up, her curiosity visible. Brenda's eyes widened as she listened. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She swallowed hard. Her voice was lower now. "Are you sure?" "No, I didn't know." Another pause. "Then yes, I understand." She hung up the phone and turned slowly. Jenna stepped forward. "Is everything okay?" Brenda didn't answer right away. She just stood there, hands trembling slightly. The color had drained from her face. Jenna asked again. Softer this time, Brenda blinked and finally spoke. "The captain wants to speak with me." Now she walked out of the galley, her steps no longer sharp or confident. The passengers watched as she made her way to the front, shoulders stiff, but eyes unfocused. Greg leaned over and whispered to Karen. "Something's happening," Karen replied without turning her head. I think she just figured out who she's been talking down to. Ethan sat quietly, hands in his lap, laptop shut and back in his bag. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't proud, but he felt something settle inside, something still and sure. Not revenge, not victory, just truth finally seen. And it was only beginning. Brenda reached the cockpit door, her throat dry and her chest tight. She had walked these aisles for 2 decades, and never once had she been summoned mid-flight by the captain. She pressed the call button beside the door, and a few seconds later the door clicked open. Captain Brian stood inside, arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable. "Come in," he said simply. Brenda stepped in slowly. The cockpit felt smaller than usual. The air thicker. Rachel, the co-pilot, gave her a brief glance but said nothing. Brian turned toward her and spoke in a calm, controlled voice. "We've received a direct communication from Air Operations. It was flagged urgent. There's a passenger on board who's been working on a live aviation security assignment, one with federal authorization." Brenda blinked, confused. What he is? A teenage cybersecurity trainee. Brian continued, "Part of a government testing initiative, hand-picked, monitored, cleared. He accessed the aircraft systems from a public channel, not to hack us but to highlight weak spots in real time. And he's already closed several vulnerabilities we didn't even know existed." Brenda's eyes widened. "Wait, what, who?" Brian looked straight at her. "Row 4 seat, she froze. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "That can't be right. That kid's just, she trailed off. "Has what?" Brian asked, his voice sharper now. "Because from what I've just heard, he's more qualified than anyone else on this plane to be near that system. And instead of treating him with professionalism, you humiliated him." Repeatedly, Brenda stammered. "He didn't know. He didn't say anything. He just had a laptop open, and I thought." "You thought he didn't belong there?" Brian interrupted. "You didn't ask. You assumed. You embarrassed him in front of a full cabin, and now you've embarrassed this airline." Brenda's face flushed red, then pale. "I wasn't trying to. I was only following protocol." Rachel turned slightly in her seat. "Protocol doesn't give you the right to insult people, especially not people who are quietly doing their job better than you're doing yours." Brian sighed. "We're filing a report when we land. But first you're going to apologize." Brenda's head snapped up. "What you heard me," Brian said. "You will apologize to that boy, clearly, publicly, and respectfully." Brenda swallowed hard. Her voice was quieter now. "Do I have to do it in front of everyone?" "Yes," Brian replied without hesitation. "Because you insulted him in front of everyone. That's where the apology belongs." She didn't answer. She just turned slowly and left the cockpit. Her feet dragged now, her steps no longer confident, no longer proud. As she moved back into the cabin, her eyes locked on row 4. The boy who she had called useless was seated upright, calm, looking out the window. His laptop was packed away. His face was still unreadable. The cabin was silent. The other passengers had picked up that something important had happened. Karen sat forward, watching closely. Greg leaned out into the aisle, his arms crossed. Jenna peeked from behind the galley curtain, her lips tight and her eyes wide. Brenda stopped beside Ethan's seat. Everyone was looking now. Her voice cracked a little as she began. "I need to say something," she said loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Earlier I said some things that were unkind, unprofessional, and wrong. I judged someone without reason. I let my assumptions guide my behavior. And for that I owe this passenger a full apology." She paused. Her face had softened. "I was wrong to treat you the way I did." "I'm sorry." Ethan didn't move for a moment. Then he looked at her. His expression didn't show anger or smugness. Just quiet thought. Brenda turned and began walking back toward the galley without another word. Past Greg, who didn't look at her, and Karen, who shook her head slightly. When Brenda disappeared behind the curtain, a gentle rustle moved through the cabin. It wasn't applause. It wasn't loud. It was just a collective shift, shoulders settling, tension easing. Ethan leaned back against the window. He didn't feel victorious. What happened wasn't about winning. It was about being seen, being respected, being treated like he mattered. Because he did, a few rows behind Greg, leaned over and whispered to his wife. He didn't even raise his voice once, she nodded. Didn't need to. From the cockpit, Brian's voice came through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please make sure your tray tables are locked and your devices are turned off, unless of course you're a federal tech prodigy with special clearance. A ripple of soft laughter moved through the cabin. Ethan cracked a small smile for the first time. What none of them knew was that this was only the beginning. A call had already been made. A team on the ground was waiting to meet him, and the moment this plane touched down, everything in Brenda's world and his was about to shift again. The plane had started its slow descent, and the light above flashed. Prepare for landing, seatbacks clicked into place. Window shades were lifted, and quiet filled the cabin once again. But this silence wasn't like before. This time it was thick with tension, an invisible current of curiosity and unease running beneath the surface. Ethan sat still in his seat, looking calm, but his mind wasn't resting. He had known from the moment Brenda first looked at him that the flight would be different. He was used to judgment tests, to being overlooked or underestimated, but this time he had just stood his ground. He had taken control in the only way he knew how, with skill, silence, and precision. Brenda remained behind the curtain in the galley, out of sight. She hadn't returned to the aisle since her apology, and truthfully, no one expected her. Jenna took over the final checks, moving row by row, securing tray tables and reminding passengers to buckle up. She looked more confident now, as if something had changed inside her too. As Jenna passed Ethan's row, she paused. Her voice was soft. Do you need anything before we land? Ethan shook his head. She nodded and moved on, but her expression carried a quiet respect, not the fake kind people wear to be polite. This was different. This was real. A few rows behind, Greg shifted in his seat, pulling his seatbelt snug. He hadn't taken his eyes off Ethan since the apology. He leaned slightly toward Karen and whispered, I hope someone's waiting for him when we land. Someone important? Karen replied, I think they are. In the cockpit. Brian received another alert, this time through his secure line. It wasn't a warning. It was a confirmation. The moment the wheels touched the ground, a car from the aviation department would be waiting at the gate. They had confirmed Ethan's ID and were prepared to debrief him in person. Brian didn't know all the details, but he didn't need to. He already knew what mattered. This boy had done something remarkable, and no one would forget it. As the landing gear lowered and the city came into view below the clouds, Ethan reached into his backpack. He pulled out a small notebook and began to write. Not typing, not coding, just scribbling down a few notes in pencil. No one else noticed, but this was part of his process. Every test, every experience. He logged it by hand. It helped him remember what went right and what went wrong. He paused for a moment, then underlined a sentence he had just written. Assumptions are louder than words. The plane touched down with a soft bump. The cabin jolted slightly as the wheels hit the tarmac, then rolled smooth as the jet slowed. A soft cheer came from a toddler in the back, followed by light claps from a few first-time flyers. But most passengers sat quiet, exchanging looks of relief and curiosity. Over the intercom, Captain Brian's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. For safety, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened until we reach the gate. We'll be pulling into a private section of the terminal for routine checks. No one questioned the unusual message. Most assumed it was just standard procedure. But a few, especially those who had watched the scene earlier, knew something more was happening. The jet rolled slowly to a stop outside the window. A black vehicle waited near the edge of the tarmac. Two officials stood beside it, wearing dark blazers and communication earpieces. They weren't airport staff. They didn't carry luggage or push carts. They were there for one person only. Ethan zipped up his backpack, slid his notebook inside, and waited. He didn't look around for approval or applause. He wasn't interested in being the center of attention. All he had wanted was to be treated like everyone else, and when that failed, he let his work speak. Brenda, still hidden in the back, peeked through the curtain. Her stomach twisted when she saw the black car. She had hoped the apology would be enough, that things would settle quietly. But seeing those officials outside told her this wasn't going away. And the worst part wasn't just what she'd done. It was the fact that everyone had seen it. The man she tried to humiliate had turned out to be the most respected person on the plane. The seatbelt light went off with a soft ding. Passengers stood up slowly, gathering their things. Stretching their legs, Greg stood and waited, allowing others to move ahead. As Ethan rose from his seat, backpack slung over one shoulder, Jenna appeared beside him. "Someone's waiting for you outside," she said softly. "They just radioed in." Ethan nodded. "Once I know." She smiled faintly. "It was an honor flying with you." He didn't say anything, just gave her a quiet look that said more than words. Then he stepped into the aisle and walked forward, calm, quiet, collected. As he reached the front of the plane, the door opened slowly. Sunlight poured in, and the wind from the runway brushed his hoodie lightly. The two officials standing on the tarmac nodded at him with clear recognition. One of them stepped forward and said, "Mr. Taylor." Ethan nodded. "We're ready for your report." Without a glance back, he stepped off the plane, and behind him the cabin stayed still. Not because he was gone, but because everyone left inside understood exactly what had just happened. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't shouted, he hadn't needed to prove anything, and yet by the time the wheels hit the ground, he had changed the entire flight. As Ethan stepped onto the tarmac, the two officials flanked him with quiet respect. They weren't here to escort him like a child. They were here because of what he'd just done. One of them, a tall man in his 40s with a calm voice, handed him a secure tablet. "Command wants the live documentation from your uplink. They said your patch went through clean." Ethan nodded and entered his login code. The tablet blinked, syncing to his encrypted drive, and the officials watched closely. His posture was calm, but there was a quiet strength to how he carried himself, like he knew exactly where he stood. Inside the plane, the atmosphere had changed again. Passengers stood frozen at their seats or peeked out the windows to get a better view of the black car, and men in suits waiting for Ethan whispers filled the cabin like light static. Did they just call him Mr. Taylor? They were expecting him. What was he even doing with that laptop? Greg still standing near. Row 5 crossed his arms and shook his head slowly. "I knew there was something about that kid. He handled the whole thing better than most grown men I know." Karen, collecting her bag from the overhead bin, glanced toward the front. "Brenda's probably praying nobody posts the video." And she was right to think that just a few rows behind, a woman in her 30s named Paige had quietly recorded that earlier confrontation. She hadn't intended to share it at first, but now she was thinking differently. She had captured the moment Brenda slammed the laptop, closed the argument, the apology, the shift in tone when the captain's voice hinted something bigger was going on. Paige didn't know the whole story, but she had captured the energy of it, the arrogance, the disrespect, the surprise on Brenda's face when the tables turned. She stared at the video on her phone. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it felt powerful. The clip was just over 3 minutes long, and it said everything without saying much at all. She didn't hit upload, not yet, but she saved it. Brenda, meanwhile, was still seated in the back galley on the folding jump seat. Her hands were tightly clasped in her lap, her uniform now wrinkled and her face pale. She had known the moment she saw the black car that this wasn't going to fade. She had tried to explain it away to herself. He looked like trouble. He was acting suspicious. She was just being careful, but deep down she knew she hadn't seen a problem. She had created one. Her judgment had been based on nothing but her own bias, and it had failed her. Jenna approached, slowly carrying her clipboard. She paused, looked at Brenda for a moment, and said quietly, "They're ready for you to disembark." Brenda looked up, then down again. "Are they waiting to speak to me?" Jenna didn't answer right away. "I don't know. But if I were you, I'd be prepared to answer some hard questions." Brenda stood slowly, every movement heavy. As she stepped out into the aisle, several passengers stepped back, not out of the way, but out of choice. No one made eye contact. No one offered a polite smile. The warmth she was used to receiving after every flight was gone. Greg stepped aside, but his eyes stayed on her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The disappointment was written clearly on his face. Brenda moved toward the exit, and as she reached the doorway, she saw Ethan a short distance away, on the runway, standing beside the black vehicle, speaking with the officials. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't showing off. He just looked steady. Unbothered professional. That's when it really hit her. This wasn't some awkward teenager trying to get attention. This was someone being trusted by people at the highest level. Someone who had been chosen, tested, and proved, long before she ever assumed otherwise. The stairs felt longer than usual as she descended. No one greeted her at the bottom. No nod, no handshake. Just the sound of wheels rolling on luggage and the gusts of wind cutting through the silence. She looked over her shoulder once at Ethan, and he didn't even notice her. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care anymore. He had said everything he needed to say without saying much at all. Inside the terminal, a small team from the aviation agency had already begun preparing a quiet room for the debrief. Ethan would be asked to walk through each part of the scan, every system he tested, and the fix he implemented. He would also be asked about the incident with the flight attendant. Not for drama, but because this wasn't the first time something like it had happened during one of their test flights, but it might be the last time someone underestimated the person doing the testing. As passengers trickled into the terminal and walked past the black SUV parked nearby, more whispers began, some snapped photos. Others just shook their heads, stunned that the same boy who had been called useless only an hour ago was now standing like someone 10 years older, being treated like an expert. Paige scrolled through the video again on her phone. At the end, there was a clear shot of Brenda's face when she realized who she was dealing with. A look of disbelief, then regret. Paige hit upload. The title she gave it was short, but it said everything she called him useless. Then he shut down the jet. Within the next few hours, the story would begin to spread, and by nightfall, the world would start asking, who was this boy, and why had he stayed so quiet when he had all the power? They were about to find out. By the time Ethan stepped inside the private debriefing room, the airport terminal buzzed with movement outside its glass walls. Passengers rolled suitcases toward connecting flights. Children clutched snacks from vending machines, and airline staff moved briskly, unaware that something far from routine was happening in the quiet room beyond Gate 17. The room itself was plain white walls, one long table, 3 chairs, and a screen already set up with his data displayed. A woman in a navy blazer stood when he entered. She looked to be in her early 50s, with silver-framed glasses and a tablet in hand. She offered a polite nod. "Mr. Taylor, thank you for arriving on short notice." Ethan nodded. "Once I figured you'd want the logs right away." "We do," she said, gesturing toward a chair. "I'm Dana Powell, head of system security. This is Jordan McNeil, flight data analyst." A tall man seated beside her gave Ethan a small wave and a grin. "Big move back there," Jordan said casually. That patch was clean. Fast, too. Ethan sat down and placed his laptop on the table. He connected it via the secure cable already provided. Within seconds, the system lit up with a full breakdown of his activity, onboard timestamps, code revisions, flagged vulnerabilities, and most importantly, a record of how the system had been exposed during the flight. Dana leaned forward. "Before we get into the technical side, I want to say something. What happened on that plane, what was said to you, how you were treated, it's not just disappointing. It's unacceptable." Ethan didn't look away. He was used to people softening their tone after the fact. Dana continued. "This isn't the first complaint we've received about crew members making poor assumptions during test flights. But this is the first time it's been caught in real time, by someone who refused to lose focus even while being disrespected." Jordan added, "Honestly, if you had chosen to stop working and report her instead, no one would have blamed you, but you stayed calm and finished the job." "That says a lot," Ethan shrugged lightly. "I didn't do it for her. I did it for the system. If a patch is missed, someone could get hurt. That matters more." Dana nodded slowly, watching him. "You know, you remind me of a guy we had years ago. Quiet, young, brilliant people didn't take him seriously until he uncovered a vulnerability in 2 commercial fleets. Now he runs our airborne encryption division. I'm not trying to run anything," Ethan said, almost smiling. "I just like fixing broken things." Jordan chuckled. "Well, you fixed a few today." They reviewed the logs, walking through each step Ethan had taken, from the moment he logged into the network route he mapped to the code he deployed to block the exposed signal. The entire session took just over an hour, and by the end, both analysts had leaned back in their chairs, visibly impressed. Before Ethan stood to leave, Dana spoke again. "We're pushing your report through as high priority. It'll be referenced in next month's operations meeting, and your name will be on it. We'll also be sending a formal recommendation to your program lead. This won't be your last flight." Mr. Taylor Ethan zipped his backpack without a word, but this time the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Before you go," Jordan said, pulling up a browser tab, "you should see this." He turned the screen toward Ethan. It was the video, the one recorded by Paige during the flight. The clip showed Brenda's face as she hovered over him, her words sharp and unnecessary. Then the moment Greg spoke up, and finally Brenda's stiff apology near the front of the plane. The footage was clean and clear. It had been shared by someone named Paige in the clouds, and within 2 hours it had already hit over 300,000 views. The caption read, "Teen hacker silently exposes prejudice at 30,000 feet. Respect Isern, watch this kid." The comment section was exploding with reactions. "She really thought he was just a kid now. She's the one who's grounded. Notice how he never raised his voice. That's Power Airlines better start training their staff better. This is embarrassing. Who is this kid? Someone hire him already." Ethan leaned closer, watching his own still face on the video comm, collected, saying nothing while the storm moved around him. "He didn't reply to the post. He didn't like it. He didn't share it. He just said, 'I didn't ask for this.'" Dana nodded. "You didn't. But it found you anyway." As Ethan left the room and stepped back into the terminal, the world outside the glass door had changed. People were still walking. Flights were still being called, but several passengers from his earlier flight were now standing together looking at phones and whispering. Some recognized him. One woman raised her hand slightly as if to wave but didn't follow through. Respect had replaced curiosity. He walked past them quietly, never speeding up, never slowing down. His hoodie still pulled slightly over his head, his backpack still light on his shoulder. In the distance, Brenda sat alone in a side room meant for crew members under review. She had been called in by the base supervisor for an immediate meeting. She didn't have a statement prepared. She wasn't ready, and she couldn't stop thinking about the boy she'd told to stay out of the way. No one was telling him that now, and everyone, including her, was watching where he was going. The airport corridor was busy, but Ethan walked through it like it was empty. He kept his head down, not from fear or shame, but to keep the noise out. He was used to moving through crowds unnoticed, used to being the quiet one in the room, the one people brushed past without thinking twice. That used to bother him. But now, after what had just unfolded on that plane, he found something different in the silence piece. At the far end of the concourse, a sleek car with dark-tinted windows waited by a private exit. The driver stood outside holding a placard with Ethan's name printed clean across it. This wasn't a reward. This was protocol. The agency had arranged his pickup in advance, but it felt different now. Like people were finally seeing what he'd always known he was capable of. He nodded to the driver and slid into the back seat. As the car pulled away, his phone vibrated. A message popped up from an unknown number. "Excellent field report. We're reviewing the footage now. You did the right thing. Stay ready." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He just locked the screen and rested his head back against the seat. Outside the window, planes were lifting into the sky, one after another, and he watched them go, not with envy, but with calm certainty. He would be flying again soon, and next time things would be different from the start. Back inside the airport, things were not so calm. In a side office near the staff hallway, Brenda sat stiffly across from a uniformed supervisor named Alan, who held a printed report in his hand. His eyes moved over the page slowly, his lips pressed into a firm line. "This is the official passenger incident log," he said, tapping the paper with his finger. "I have statements from 2 passengers, a crew member, and the captain. I also have video footage that's been viewed nearly 500,000 times in the last 3 hours." Brenda nodded once her hands locked tightly in her lap. Alan leaned back. "What happened up there?" She opened her mouth, then hesitated. "It started when I saw the boy using his laptop during taxi. I told him to shut it down. He didn't respond immediately. He looked at me, just looked at you. She nodded. It was the way he looked, like he was challenging me. Alan sighed. So you decided that meant he didn't belong in the seat he paid for? Brenda's voice faltered. No, it's not like that. I thought maybe he was in the wrong section. I was trying to keep order. He raised an eyebrow by calling him useless. In front of the cabin, her voice dropped. I didn't think anyone heard that. But they did, Alan said firmly. And now it's everywhere. This airline is being dragged online right now. And not because of a delay or a missed meal or a rerouted flight. Because one of our own humiliated a minor who was working under direct authorization from a federal program. And that minor may have prevented a much bigger problem with his quiet professional response. Brenda's eyes filled with tears, but she held them in. I didn't know who he was. Alan shook his head. That's the point. You didn't ask. You just assumed silence settled between them. The air was cold and heavy. Finally, he slid a document across the desk. This is a formal notice of suspension, pending further review. You'll turn in your badge before leaving the building. There will be an internal investigation, and depending on the outcome, your position may not be reinstated. Brenda didn't argue. She didn't beg, she just nodded. In her mind, she played the moment over and over. The first time she looked at Ethan, the way he stayed calm when she pushed him. The quiet strength he never dropped, even when the cabin turned against her. Across the airport, Greg sat at a coffee shop with his phone open on the table. He'd been reading comments under the video for almost an hour. They came in from everywhere, students, professionals, even a few airline workers who admitted to having seen similar behavior before. The comment that stuck. With him, the most simply read, he didn't need to raise his voice. The truth did it for him. Greg took a sip of his coffee, then scrolled back to the beginning of the video. He watched Ethan's face as the laptop was slammed shut, then watched it again when Brenda delivered her awkward apology. There was something about the boy's stillness. Oh, he didn't look away. Didn't lower his head. That kind of poise wasn't normal for someone his age. It was rare, it was earned. Karen walked over with a newspaper tucked under her arm. Guess what's on the front page of the travel section? He looked up the video. She nodded. They're calling it Flight 227. The lesson at 30,000 feet. Greg leaned back in his chair, letting out a soft laugh. He taught more in 6 minutes than most people do in a lifetime. Far beyond the airport, Ethan's story had already begun spreading in ways no one expected. Tech magazines picked it up, aviation blogs reposted the footage, and within hours calls came in from education groups, cybersecurity firms, and speaking panels. But Ethan didn't chase any of it. He was already writing new code, because while the world was trying to catch up to who he was already becoming something more. The next morning, Ethan sat alone at his desk in his small, neatly kept bedroom. Sunlight streamed through the half-open blinds, dust particles, catching the light as they floated lazily in the quiet air. His laptop was open, but he wasn't typing. Instead, he stared at the screen, eyes locked on the dozens of emails that had poured in overnight. Subject lines filled the inbox. We'd like to speak with you. Depth of transportation tech innovators. Youth panel invitation to keynote. Your story is inspiring. We want to feature you. Full scholarship offer. We saw the footage. He scrolled through them slowly, then minimized the window. He wasn't looking for praise. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Yet maybe space, maybe silence. Or maybe a moment that had nothing to do with being impressive. On the edge of his desk sat the same notebook he'd used on the plane. He opened it to the page he had marked the night before. His own handwriting stared back at him. Assumptions are louder than words. He added another line underneath. Silence doesn't mean powerless. There was a knock on his door. It creaked open slowly, and his older brother Tyler peeked in. You coming down? Mom's making pancakes. She says it's a celebration day. Ethan gave a small smile. For what? Tyler stepped inside and raised an eyebrow. You kidding me? You just got more views than my graduation video, and I was in a cap and gown. Ethan laughed quietly. That's not hard. Tyler smirked. Seriously though. Mom's proud. She keeps showing that video to Aunt Lorraine. You might want to eat before she makes you sit down for a second. Viewing. Ethan nodded. He'll be down in a minute. As Tyler left, Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. The world outside looked the same. Kids on bikes rode past the driveway. A dog barked 2 houses down somewhere. A lawnmower buzzed to life. But he felt different, not because of the recognition or the offers, but because he had finally proven something, not to them, but to himself. Back at the airport, Brenda was sitting in a meeting room at headquarters. Her eyes were tired, her voice strained. She was in front of a disciplinary board now, and the tone was different. No sympathy, no excuses, just questions. Do you understand the weight of your actions? Yes, she said quietly. Do you understand the damage done to the airline's reputation? Yes, and the potential legal exposure we now face from federal programs due to your treatment of a minor under contract? Brenda hesitated, then said again, yes. The lead officer on the panel tapped his pen against the table. You've been with this company a long time. Brenda, you've earned respect over the years. But yesterday you let bias get in the way of judgment. That's not just a mistake, it's a liability. Brenda didn't defend herself. She couldn't have watched the footage too many times now, seen her own expression, her posture, her words. There was no fixing it. There was only living with it. Outside the room, a copy of the company's employee conduct manual sat on a table, freshly updated to include a new case study. Hers, meanwhile, back in Ethan's world, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a video call from a name he didn't recognize at first. He answered it anyway. A woman in a navy blazer appeared on screen, framed by bookshelves and a wall of certifications. Hi, Mr. Taylor, she said with a warm smile. I'm calling on behalf of the National Aviation Safety Council. I won't take much of your time, but I wanted to personally invite you to speak at our annual summit. You'd be our youngest ever presenter. Ethan blinked, unsure how to respond. You don't have to answer now, she continued, but I hope you'll consider it. Sometimes the best voices are the ones that speak the least, but when they do, everyone listens. She smiled again, thanked him, and ended the call. Ethan stared at the screen. His reflection stared back, half lit by the glow of the monitor. Later that day, as news articles continued to spread, and clips from the flight bounced from one media outlet to another, the headlines began to change. No longer just teen hacks, jet mid-flight. They began focusing on the deeper story, how quiet genius silenced prejudice at 30,000 feet. The calmest kid on the plane became the most powerful one. He didn't demand respect. He earned it at school. Teachers began mentioning his name with pride. Students started whispering in the halls. A few tried to act like they'd always known he was that smart, though most had never really spoken to him before. But Ethan didn't seek the spotlight. He stayed in the back of the room taking notes, just like always. Except now when he raised his hand, people listened, and when he walked into a room, they looked up not with confusion, but with curiosity. That night, as the sky outside turned dark, he opened his laptop again and created a new folder. He named it Flight 227 Closure. Inside it, he saved every log, every report, every document from that day. Then he created a second folder, Flight 228 Next Mission. Because while everyone else was still talking about what he did, Ethan was already thinking about what he would do next. It had been 3 days since the flight, but the storm it stirred hadn't slowed. On social media, Ethan's name had become a trending topic in tech travel and education circles. Commentators on morning shows debated the broader meaning of the incident. Some praised him as a symbol of calm intelligence in the face of prejudice. Others dug deeper, asking how someone like him had gone unnoticed for so long. But Ethan hadn't joined any of the conversations. Not once, while news clips looped on TV and his inbox filled with invitations, Ethan sat in his usual spot, second desk from the back, in his computer science classroom. Hoodie pulled up, pen tapping quietly on his notebook. He wasn't avoiding attention, he just didn't need it. His focus was already forward. Across the room, students who once barely noticed him now stole glances every few minutes. A few whispered when he passed. Some tried to say hi in the hallway, hoping for a response, a nod, anything. Most got nothing more than a polite nod or a quiet, "Hey." It wasn't arrogance. It was just Ethan. His teacher, Mr. Reynolds, cleared his throat at the front of the room. "Before we get into today's lesson, I want to take a moment," he said. The class looked up. One of our own did something pretty incredible this week. I think you all know who I'm talking about. All heads turned toward Ethan, who sat still, eyes lowered. "Ethan, am not going to embarrass you with applause or speeches," Mr. Reynolds said with a small smile. "But I'll say this, you proved something a lot bigger than your tech skills. You showed how to stay composed under pressure. That matters more than any code you'll ever write." Ethan gave a slow nod. Mr. Reynolds moved on and the classroom settled back into its usual rhythm. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Ethan had gone from invisible to undeniable. He hadn't asked for respect. He had shown why it was deserved. Meanwhile, at the airline's central headquarters, meetings were held behind closed doors. Executives debated how to handle the fallout. The incident had made international headlines, and now they were scrambling to rebuild trust. Policies were reviewed, training manuals were rewritten, but the hardest task remained addressing the public perception that their crew had failed a chilled one who turned out to be smarter, faster, and calmer than any adult on board. Brenda had already been removed from active duty. The airline wouldn't confirm if she was fired, but she was no longer on the schedule. Internally, her name had become a quiet warning among staff. Not spoken out loud, but referenced in glances and clipped phrases. Pulling a Brenda now meant assuming too much about someone you didn't understand. The company issued a formal statement: "We deeply regret the incident aboard Flight 227. We've initiated internal reviews and are working closely with federal partners to ensure all passengers, regardless of age, background, or appearance, are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." But the public wasn't easily convinced. Comments flooded every post. The airline made demanding more than an apology. Some asked why Ethan had been ignored. Others wanted to know how many more Ethans were being overlooked every day. One journalist posted a thread that went viral. He was quiet, so they thought he was weak. He was young, so they assumed he was inexperienced. He was different, so they decided he didn't belong. But when everything broke down, he didn't. He stood still, stayed calm, and solved it all. That's what real strength looks like. In a quiet office at the Department of Transportation, a man named Stephen Moore read the thread. He was one of the top advisors in the Federal Aviation Safety Division. As he scrolled through the tweets and read Ethan's name over and over, he tapped a pen against his desk. Across the room, a colleague asked, "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Stephen nodded slowly. "Hes ready." They opened to file Ethan's program application. Until now, he had only been granted limited access as part of a junior trainee initiative. But after Flight 227, that label no longer fit. His performance under real-world pressure, his ability to identify and neutralize vulnerabilities mid-flight, and his refusal to escalate during personal attack. It all pointed to something more. Stephen picked up the phone and dialed a secure extension. "I want to move Taylor to Tier 1. No more trial work. Give him full clearance." The voice on the other end hesitated. "He's still in high school." "Exactly," Stephen said. "And he already operates better than most grown analysts. I've trained Hess, not a problem. Has the future." That same night, Ethan sat at his desk again. He wasn't reading comments or watching interviews. He was coding, not for praise, not for attention, just because it calmed him. His screen glowed softly in the dark room, lines of logic building like bricks, one function feeding the next. A new patch, a better one, something he'd thought of after reviewing the data from Flight 227. The world could keep talking, he'd keep building. Halfway through the session, a new email appeared. This one had no flashy subject line, just a string of numbers and a clearance seal. His eyes scanned the message quickly. Subject: Tier 1 authorization. Effective immediately. New credentials, attached assignment. Incoming. Ethan blinked, then smiled barely. This wasn't just about a flight anymore. Not about Brenda, not about the video or the comments or the headlines. This was about where he was headed next, and nobody was going to see that coming either. By the end of the week, Ethan's name had quietly moved from internet feeds to internal boardrooms, from social media trends to classified email threads. His quiet rise, marked by calm precision and unshakable focus, had reached corners of the industry few his age even knew existed. While the world still clung to headlines and think pieces, Ethan was already stepping into another layer of responsibility, one that didn't come with applause but with silence and security clearance. It was Saturday morning when the next assignment arrived, not through email, but by courier. A man in a dark coat arrived at the Taylor residence just after dawn. He didn't say much, just handed a sealed envelope to Ethan's. Mother smiled politely and walked back to a nondescript vehicle parked at the curb. Inside the envelope was a simple card embossed with a small federal seal and an online message. Prepare for on-site evaluation. Confidential project. You'll be briefed upon arrival. There was no return address, no time slot, no name, just coordinates and a date. Monday, 8:00 a.m. When Ethan read it, he didn't flinch. He just nodded, once went to his room and quietly began preparing. He didn't tell his friends, he didn't make a post. While classmates filled their weekend with games, group chats, and mall meetups, Ethan ran simulations on his laptop, cross-checked systems data, and mentally walked through every known cyber vulnerability in commercial aircraft built in the last 6 years. By Sunday evening, his backpack was packed. Not with clothes, but with hard drives, custom tools, and his now well-worn notebook. He added one new line before closing it. Silence is the only warning they get. That night, his mom stood at his doorway as he zipped his bag. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked gently. Ethan paused, then looked up at her. "They wouldn't have sent for me if I wasn't." She smiled faintly, brushing his hair back. "You've always seen things other people miss." He didn't say anything, but he appreciated it more than she knew. The next morning came fast. The car that picked him up was quiet, smooth, and marked only by a small federal tag on the dash. The driver gave a polite nod and confirmed his name, but offered no further details. The ride lasted just under 2 hours, moving from busy city streets to industrial backroads, and finally through a secured gate guarded by 2 silent officers. Beyond the gate stood a tall building, unmarked gray with tinted windows. This wasn't a government office. This was a research site, and not the kind that shows up on Google Maps. Ethan was met at the door by a woman in a black blazer and thin-framed glasses. She introduced herself only as Ms. Keene and offered her hand. "We've been watching your work for some time," she said as they walked through a quiet hallway. "Flight 227 just confirmed what we already suspected." Ethan kept pace beside her eyes, scanning every detail. The badges on the walls, the pattern of the lights, even the lack of windows in certain sections. Keene continued, "We're not here to interview you. We're here to test you." They entered a room filled with equipment, rows of screens, simulated cockpit panels, live data feeds from test planes in the air. A tall man stood beside a console. Arms folded, he turned when they walked in. "This is Cole Keene," said he's our systems architect. "Today he's your obstacle." Cole gave a half smile. "I've been building these firewalls for 20 years. Let's see how long it takes you to break them." Ethan didn't smile back. He just set his bag on the table, pulled out his laptop, and began plugging in. "What's the protocol?" he asked. Cole raised an eyebrow. "No instructions, no map. You'll find the vulnerabilities on your own. You have 90 minutes, no second tries." Keene added, "This is a real system, not a simulation. It's connected to a flight lab running live. Avionics, you get in, you win. You don't, we send you home." Ethan nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and began. The room went quiet except for the hum of machines and the soft tapping of keys. At first it seemed impossible. The network was layered in complexity, each gate guarded by high-grade security. But Ethan didn't panic. He looked for patterns, gaps in timing, slight shifts in data response, old code buried under newer patches. After 30 minutes, he found his first door and slipped in unnoticed. Cole raised an eyebrow. After 45, Ethan shut down a loop running in the background, one Cole hadn't even mentioned. At the 60-minute mark, he bypassed the internal GPS mimic and launched a diagnostic ping that sent a full report to the mainframe. Then he stopped typing, leaned back, and said, "Done." Keene walked to the screen and stared at the logs. Cole stepped forward and scrolled through the data with a frown. After several tense seconds, he gave a small, grudging laugh. "I've never seen anyone catch that satellite reroute," he muttered. "That was a trap. You weren't supposed to find it." Ethan replied, calm as ever, "Then maybe don't leave holes where you think people won't look." Keene turned to Ethan and extended a folder. "Welcome to Tier 1. You won't be going back to trial work. From here on out, you're part of the Black File team. No public projects, no press. Full security access. Ethan took the folder without hesitation. What's the first assignment? Keen smiled. We'll let you know, but next time something breaks 30,000 feet up, we won't be calling adults. As they escorted him back down the hallway, Ethan passed a glass window. Behind it was a wall filled with photospace prodigies, innovators, experts who had joined the agency over the years. One frame at the end had just been mounted. A plain black border, no name yet, just space. Miss Keen stopped beside it. That one's yours. You'll earn it after your first field deployment. Ethan looked at it for a long moment, then nodded. He didn't need the title. He didn't need the photo. He just needed the work. Because brilliance, real brilliance, didn't come from shouting. It came from doing what no one else could quietly, precisely, and before anyone realized how badly they needed it, and the world was just beginning to realize it now. By midweek, Ethan had already been briefed on 3 separate systems requiring his attention, 2 related to commercial aircraft infrastructure, and 1 classified as non-civilian, flagged only by a red warning bar and a countdown clock. No further explanation had been provided. He didn't ask for one. He had learned early on that questions in this space often revealed more about your readiness than your answers did. His days now started before sunrise. He no longer walked into school with a slow, quiet step. He still moved the same way, hoodie up, eyes down, but there was something different behind it. Purpose, direction. While classmates talked about weekend trips or complained about assignments, Ethan reviewed security schematics during lunch, ran simulations in his mind between periods, and spent afternoons not in clubs or sports, but in digital silence preparing for scenarios no one else even knew existed. The school had tried to reach out. His principal called twice, offering to recognize his achievements with a special ceremony. Ethan politely declined both times. He didn't want a stage. He didn't want a plaque. That Thursday, a new file appeared in his encrypted inbox. Subject code 7, clearance red line, intercept evaluation location, undisclosed hangar facility. Eastern Seaboard arrival immediate. The file included a transport voucher and access instructions for a private airfield outside of the city. This was different from the last assignments, sharper in tone, stripped of any formality, a plain directive, no signature. By the time Ethan arrived, it was nearly dusk. The hangar stood isolated near the edge of a decommissioned runway, surrounded by cracked concrete and silence. No visible staff, no noise. The wind moved across the tarmac like a whisper pushing dried leaves and dust in soft circles. Inside, a single aircraft stood parked under bright white lights. It wasn't commercial, sleek, angular, painted in flat matte gray with no markings. No logos, no windows visible from the outside. 2 men stood near its underside, speaking quietly in clipped tones. One held a clipboard, the other had a military bearing tall. Square-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed haircut and a guarded expression, Ethan approached without hesitation. The man with the military posture stepped forward. "You're the kid." Ethan stopped calm. "You're the pilot." The man stared for a second, then smirked. "You've got guts." The clipboard was handed over. Ethan flipped it open and reviewed the specs. The aircraft was a prototype part of a next-gen fleet built with hybrid engine tech and a classified navigation interface that had gone offline during a test run the previous week. Multiple analysts had reviewed it. None had found the root cause. Now they wanted him too. Ethan set his bag down, pulled out his console, and glanced at the pilot. "How long do I have?" The man crossed his arms. 30 minutes until we lose daylight. You find it by then, I'll buy you dinner. You'd only pause, you'll fly home, knowing you missed something no one else could solve." Ethan nodded and got to work. The first thing he noticed was the layer beneath the primary interface, a shadow protocol built to auto-erase every 15 minutes. Whoever coded it didn't want anyone digging past the surface. Most would have missed it. He didn't. With careful timing, he paused. The self-wipe mirrored the entire log into his console and began dissecting the kernel architecture. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, just before the internal wipe restarted, Ethan located the breach point, a corrupted telemetry script cross-fed into the drone stabilizer, rerouting feedback in reverse. The aircraft hadn't malfunctioned. It had been feeding on its own command signals, looping them back into the system like a mirror, slowly eating itself from the inside. He ran a correction sequence forced to sync and watched as the lights along the aircraft's tail blinked twice, then glowed steady. It was stable. He looked up. The pilot was staring at the lights, arms still crossed, lips tight. "What did you do?" the man asked. "Stopped it from arguing with itself," Ethan replied. The clipboard man walked over and handed him a signed confirmation. "You're cleared for transfer to Phase 2. The Washington brief's been updated." Ethan packed up without a word. As he left the hangar, the sun dipped behind the trees and the wind picked up again. Inside the hangar, the pilot looked over to the clipboard handler. "That kid he said is going to change everything." And he wasn't wrong. Back home across town in a quiet cafe, Brenda sat with a notepad in front of her and a cold coffee beside it. She'd spent the past week away from airports, away from uniforms, away from anything that reminded her of that flight. But today she was trying to understand what had gone wrong in her. The airline had placed her on indefinite leave pending retraining. But even if they allowed her back, she wasn't sure she wanted to return. She stared at the notepad, at the words she'd written over and over, crossing them out and writing again. Listen before assuming, ask, don't decide. Respect is given, not assigned. For the first time in her career, she was learning something she should have known long ago. She had looked at Ethan and seen a seat that didn't match the face. Now the whole world was looking at him and finally seeing what she never did. And as he boarded his next classified flight with another system to analyze and another challenge to face, Ethan wasn't thinking about her at all. He was already too far ahead. Ethan's next flight wasn't commercial, and it didn't have a row number or seatbelt signs. It wasn't bound for a city and no boarding call was made. It lifted silently in the early morning from a secure strip deep in a federal research facility, carrying a total of 4 passengers, none of whom spoke during the entire ascent. The interior of the jet was silent, stark, stripped of comfort. It wasn't meant for travel. It was built for work, for strategy, for assignments that lived outside the public eye. Ethan sat across from a woman named Adler, the same analyst who'd reviewed his Phase 1 work on the ground last week. Her hair was tied back tight, her fingers tapping lightly against a tablet. She didn't offer conversation until they were cruising above cloud level. "We're entering a new zone of operation," she said plainly. "From this point forward, every piece of data you access is classified under Red Tier. That means breach of protocol won't lead to suspension. It'll lead to federal charges." Ethan didn't flinch. "Understood." Adler turned the tablet around and showed him a live data stream. Flight telemetry, thermal feedback. A complex series of red boxes blinking in the corner. "This is from an aircraft running on foreign firmware. We believe it was altered before it ever crossed our airspace. It's flying blind, but it doesn't know it." He leaned forward, studying the code. It was elegant, not messy like most breaches. Whoever wrote it was good, too good. "How long has it been flying?" Ethan asked. 17 days. "It's been running civilian patterns while feeding duplicated logs to radar systems. Every time we think we've located it, the signal loops us back 2 minutes behind. Always late, always too slow." Ethan leaned back thinking. So it's not invisible, just faster than the people watching it. Adler nodded. "Exactly." The plane touched down an hour later at a private installation hidden behind a military weather monitoring base. Inside a narrow glass-walled operations center, Ethan was led to a console already primed with encrypted data. His instructions were short and final. Find the ghost. Break its mask. Shut it down. He worked silently for hours, moving through the code as if reading a language only he understood. The ghost aircraft signal bounced through satellites in patterns meant to confuse and distort, similar to the techniques he used to test system resilience. Only this one had been built to deceive, not discover. He began tracing the pattern, manually mapping delay loops, mocking out signal returns, reconstructing timelines in reverse. Every breakthrough brought another layer. Whoever had built this wanted to hide something far more dangerous than faulty avionics. This wasn't just a rogue drone. It was a decoy, a distraction. Then he found it, a secondary thread buried 2 layers down, its code invisible to scanners unless one looked for something missing instead of something present. It was a gap in logic, a signature left by someone confident. No one would think to check. He wrote a trigger script that forced the system to re-authenticate, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the red boxes on the monitor froze. The screen blinked. A location ping appeared. Off-grid in restricted airspace 10 miles east of a commercial corridor. Not in flight, landed. Ethan stood. You're chasing a ghost because the real aircraft is already on the ground. Adler looked up sharply. Are you certain I spoofed its echo? The system responded, that means it's no longer simulating movement. It's hiding in plain sight. She stepped over to the console eyes, scanning the coordinates. Then she picked up a secure phone and relayed the information. Within 10 minutes, the entire operations center shifted. Agents began packing gear. Encrypted tablets were unplugged and a team of technicians rushed toward the runway. Adler turned to Ethan. You just ended a 2-week wild goose chase in 4 hours. Stared at the map on the screen. What was it carrying? Adler hesitated. That's above your clearance. But he'll say this, it wasn't designed to land here. She tapped the screen. You've just saved us from something we weren't supposed to find until it was too late. As the team moved out, Ethan was escorted to a side room to rest before extraction. He sat down slowly, shoulders tense from hours of focus. His laptop sat beside him, closed but still warm. He reached for his notebook and wrote 2 more lines. Even shadows leave fingerprints. Silence only lasts as long as no one's looking. Back at home, the headlines had begun to shift again. Articles no longer focused solely on the flight. Now they were looking at the boy behind the story. Who was he? How had he gained clearance? Where did he learn this? But the answers weren't online. Ethan's name was beginning to vanish from the digital space. The agencies overseeing his work had already taken steps to limit further exposure. Any videos connected to the flight had been quietly removed from official search results. Social media accounts sharing his identity had gone inactive. He wasn't being erased, he was being protected. That afternoon, back at the Taylor home, a letter arrived by registered mail. It was addressed to Ethan, but his mother signed for it. She opened it slowly, unsure what to expect. Inside was a single card stamped in gold, with an embossed seal at the bottom, to the parents of Ethan Taylor. Your son is no longer part of a student mentorship program. He is now operating under direct clearance within a federal advisory task force for cyber aerospace development. His work will be protected, monitored, and classified. We understand that this means less visibility for his accomplishments, but rest assured his impact will only grow from here. At the bottom, a handwritten line had been added. Sometimes the loudest difference is made by the quietest voice. Ethan never saw the card. He was already boarding another jet. Another case. Another problem no one could solve. And while the world kept searching for the next big name, Ethan had already become. It just not in the way anyone expected, because legends don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they enter quietly, and then they rewrite everything. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell icon so you never miss more powerful stories like this one.